Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
After learning about why the Black Star Line failed in Marcus Garvey's own words, we've moved on to his years in prison. Part 3, The Movement in Transition, 1925 to 1927, page 163 of the book. Commentary by John Henrik Clark. The conviction of Marcus Garvey and the fragmenting of his great movement during his imprisonment at Atlanta, Georgia, were events of great sadness in Black America. It was the end of a brief era in which Marcus Garvey would instill in a people the gift of dreaming that would make them visualize again being a whole people ruling nations. Many critics of Marcus Garvey, including W.E.B. Du Bois, began to have second and somewhat more reasonable thoughts about him after he was behind bars in prison. They began to deplore the internal strife that was pulling apart what so recently had been the largest Black movement in America. Factions within the UNIA began to bid for power, and this power struggle destroyed the effectiveness of this organization. The greatest losers were the ordinary Black people who had found a home within the movement, who had been a part of something that had hope and possibly a future for them and for their children. Garvey's impact was still felt from behind prison bars. The period referred to as the Harlem Renaissance was midway in its 10-year existence. Garvey had brought about a political awareness that was influencing the literary awareness, that was influencing this literary awareness. His imprisonment and deportation did not break his spirit. He proceeded to Jamaica through Panama, where he was hailed as a hero who had not failed his people, but who had been betrayed by the people he trusted. Garvey's conduct on this occasion was characteristic. He rarely ever had a defeatist attitude. In Jamaica, he attempted to pick up the pieces of his organization and continue his work. There is serious doubt about whether W.E.B. Du Bois had enough influence alone to persuade a Liberian government to reverse its decision on permitting the members of the UNIA to establish a settlement. The important point here is that the settlement dream and the steamship line were being lost before Marcus Garvey was sent to jail. While in jail, His enemies made every effort to wreck the rest of his plans. It should be remembered that in spite of the charge that can be made against Dr. Du Bois for not understanding the objective of the UNIA and its leader Marcus Garvey, there were other adversaries possibly more dangerous. These were the people who pretended to believe in Marcus Garvey and who functioned within the framework of the UNIA. During the time Marcus Garvey was in jail and in the years immediately following his release, this motley crew of self-seeking pretenders destroyed the national and international structure of the UNIA. In Garvey's absence, Miss Amy Jacques Garvey and a few loyal followers of the movement held the organization together. At a UNIA convention that was held in 1927, a petition was sent to President Calvin Coolidge requesting clemency for Marcus Garvey. He was released later that year, but was not permitted to return to the UNIA headquarters in Harlem. He was put on a ship at New Orleans and deported to his home country, Jamaica. After Garvey, What? By Robert Minor. Greetings, Pro-Black Perspective. How are you tonight? At Carteret, New Jersey, a few years before a body of armed men drove the entire Negro population from town, burned a Negro church, and generally conducted an organized reign of terror of such sort which America calls a race riot, and what old Russia, the now dead Tsar, called a pogrom. In the state of Kentucky, there has been during the last few weeks a series of lynchings of new character. Lynchings in which the state government participated no longer as a quote unquote silent partner, merely permitting unofficial murder, but this time as an open active leader in official murder without trial. In Kentucky courts of law, Negroes accused of the crime are being given 18-minute trials, and the latest was a 10-minute trial with a mob outside the courtroom, 12 actual members of the mob in the jury box, a virtual member of the mob as judge, usually a quote unquote confession extorted by torture in a back room before the so-called trial. No defense whatever for the Negro victim, with lack of defense concealed behind the presence of so-called attorneys for the victim, and a verdict of hanging delivered to a cheering mob from 8 to 18 minutes after the ceremony began. A body of state troops, acting in fact as uniformed lynchers, is in these cases stationed between the rest of the mob and the victim until the farce can be completed. And a few days later, the sheriff acts as the mob's master of ceremonies, placing the noose and pulling the trap of the gallows. Then the ruling class of Kentucky leers into the faces of the Negro population and says, "Nigger, got a trial, didn't he?" The 12 million Americans known to be wholly or partly of African descent occupy a position which cannot much longer be tolerated by them. Enslaved and landless peasants or serfs in the agricultural southern states, working at odd jobs in the extremist poverty in cities north and south, and just now breaking into the big industry plants as workers at the heaviest labor, excluded from the more attractive forms of labor, working for a wage much below that of other workers, often excluded from trade unions, living in miserable segregated slums, systematically degraded as a low caste by a rigid social code, the Negro masses have a score of issues which are worth life and death to them. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. How are you tonight? For half a century, these or similar issues have existed, but the forces which could deal with them did not emerge. At last, the Negro was touched by the transforming chemical by entering into the large industrial labor. by becoming a part of the modern industrial proletariat, a process through which many Negroes of Negro former peasants are now going. The Negro masses are reaching the epoch of which their liberation is placed on the agenda of history. The flood of Black population into the cities of the North has generated a culture which takes the form of a fever for organization. This culture has already gone through the stage of the exclusive devotion to the exaltation of favored individuals of the race. It has reached the stage where a serious mass movement for organization and mass emancipation has come into being. The most modern of these movements, one which promises a mass character, is expressed in the American Negro Labor Congress. Simultaneously, several particular movements, such as the successful organization of the Pullman Porters and the pressure upon the American Federation of Labor for the organization of other and more basic groups, show a trend of development. At this time, all promises and realizations of mass organization among Negroes are more or less recognized as being objectively movements against capitalism. In a form, in a formal theoretical way, in thought divorced from the concrete realities, it might be reasoned that the special burdens borne by the Negro are essentially relics of feudalism, having no necessary place in a capitalist society, and that therefore these burdens can be removed within capitalist society. It might be thought that the maintenance of a system of racial inequality within the borders of a highly developed capitalist country is not necessarily to capitalist society, and that therefore, when the forward pressure of an unfavored racial group begins to express serious contradiction, capitalist society can accomplish the removal of the racial discrimination. But in concrete reality, in a concrete world, it is not so. There is not and never was a purely capitalist society. By the term capitalist society is meant a society in which capitalist forms predominate. In all capitalist societies, there are some remainers of feudal society, which become interwoven with and interdependent with the capitalist economic and state systems. In no case has the complete removal of the feudal impurities taken place, and each proletarian revolution that we have experienced has overtaken a capitalist society still retaining much of the forms of feudalism. The mere existence of a peasant class is itself a relic of feudalism, and out of this comes the alliance of the proletariat and peasantry against capitalism. In the case of America today, the existence of the Negro question is the existence in capitalist society of a remainder of a previous social system. And at the same time, it is an integral part which cannot be separated from the capitalist system as it exists here and now. For the race question is interwoven with the class question. The special disabilities put upon the Negro toilers, real proletarians and peasants, are a built in part of the concrete system of class exploitation. To any empty words about the ability of the capitalist society to abolish the special inferiority of the position of the Negro, we may answer that the capitalist system does not abolish this condition, and that the struggle of the Negro as a racial group against the inferior racial caste status shows signs of beginning to merge with the proletarian movement against capitalism. Greetings, KW Don 7. How are you tonight? When the American Negro Labor Congress was founded in Chicago at the end of the year, thing which caused a flurry amongst high capitalist and government circles was not in fact that some communists were among its leaders, but the fact that the Congress represented the merging cause of Negro equality with the cause of the labor movement. Some communists had been among those who called together the Negro Sanhedrin Conference the year before, but the government did not send any of its agents to harass the Sanhedrin. It was the combination of the Negro and labor that caused fear. It is borne out further by the fact that when the Pullman porters, not a basic not a basically important element of the railroad system, but an influential element in the Negro city populations, started to organize their trade union, the government supplied an assistant of the Attorney General of the United States to act as an organizer of strike breaking. There were other anxious counter movements, such as Coolidge's recent appointment of a commission of several prominent Negroes of the job seeking type, charged with the duty of finding quote unquote solutions for questions of race friction, a commission which, of course, it is understood, must not meddle in such matters as segregation or murder or disenfranchisement of Negroes. Greetings, Forecast. How are you this evening? It is seen that there are new developments among the masses of Negroes, developments which lead forward and which are causing a shifting of landmarks. But we are concerned here chiefly with the movement which is not so new, with the first of the organized mass movements of Negroes, and which appears still to be the largest now in existence, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. The Universal Negro Improvement Association, which seems at one time to have had about 500,000 adherents, has been in a state of constant crisis during the past 4 years and now appears to be in a process of rapid disintegration. When this movement first appeared about 8 years ago, with something of a working class character and even some traces of a working class program mingled with utopian theories somewhat resembling that of Jewish Zionism adapted to Africa and the Negro, the United States government assumed that its effect would be anti capitalist and began an uninterrupted course of persecution. Under the leadership of Marcus Garvey, the association has repeated before every attack into a more and more fantastic opportunism. The decay of this first great experience of the Negro in mass organization is one of the tragedies of the struggle for emancipation, and it is a tragedy of the most disgracefully treacherous leadership ever known. A leadership which has never hesitated to desert its followers and which today has degenerated into the gutter of scramble for direct material gain for individuals. Take up a copy of The Negro World, organ of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and try to get from it a reflection of this great world full of struggle of Negro people, or of the beginning crystallization of the forces of the Negro masses for the struggle. What do you find out about these tremendous affairs in the organ of what still claims to be the mass organization of the exploited Black people? You will find nothing whatever except a seething stew of controversy about the financial affairs, not precisely the financial affairs of the organization itself, but the financial affairs of various officers or ex-officers of the organization who have been or are now struggling for a position for themselves in an effort to obtain financial gain for themselves out of the organization. For instance, The current number of the Negro World, May 8th, shows that the sole present activities of the organization are devoted to a violent controversy over control of the remaining property of the organization in New York, the controversy over mortgages, etc., and the second effort to raise more money. For what? For the organization and struggle against the lynching of the Negro in the old or new form? No. For the struggle against segregation? No. For the struggle for the political rights of the Negro? No. For the struggle of the Negro working masses for equality in the labor movement, for equality of pay and equality of access of all kinds of jobs for organized Negro workers with organized workers in general? No. For the struggle against the Ku Klux Klan? No. For any effort of any sort whatsoever to put the Negro upon the plane of equality? No. Is there even a consistent aggressive fight for the release of the imprisoned President Marcus Garvey himself, whom the United States government framed and jailed on the mistaken idea that Garvey in some way represented an effort of liberation of the exploited Negro masses? No, not even that. Garvey's political bankruptcy is nowhere better exemplified than by the fact that he understands nothing of the possibilities of his case for mass organization in his defense. His only policy is to crawl and beg and bargain for his release. There is nothing in this organ in any way even suggesting a claim that the Negro has any rights whatsoever in this country. Two events of the last convention of the Universal Negro Improvement Association correctly foreshadowed the present situation. The first, in an importance, relates to program. Since Mr. Marcus Garvey appeals in big type for the support of the great program, let us look again at the program that was adopted at the last convention in Detroit. The substance is the nature of race problems produced by the contact of races. Race problems move on to solution and they cannot be solved except by separation or amalgamation. Thomas Jefferson proclaimed the nature of race problems and the proposed separation. Bushrod Washington, James Madison, John Marshall, James Monroe, Henry Clay, John Randolph of Roanoke, Abraham Lincoln, and Ulysses S. Grant are among the eminent men and women who took part in the African colonization movement of the blacks. The President resolution has high historical precedent. No, excuse me, the Virginia General Assembly and others through resolutions and acts supported the colonization of Liberia. The present resolution has high historical precedent and in effect memorialized the Congress to assist an important group of Negroes who wish to continue the colonization of Liberia as an independent Negro nation. The essence of this so-called program is simply the deportation of the masses of American Negroes to the African colony of the Firestone Company. Of course, it's idiotic. The only reality it has is as a means of raising money. The only other important incident of the convention, aside from the fight for control, was one which had to do with the method of employing officers of the organization. It had been a custom for several years begun at the high point of the prosperity of the organization to fix handsome salaries for officers and the custom of the officers as acting as representatives of the organization to make contracts with each individual officer for these large salaries, which ranged up to many thousands of dollars a year. supposed to be necessary for the dignity of the fancy titled men who obligingly took the position of leadership. The result was that during the past few years, the UNIA has found that with the internal dispute, there came an ousting of some officer and a consequent lawsuit of the officer for the enormous salaries stipulated in the contract of employment. Of course, the Treasury was drained with constant court judgments in favor of ousted officers. It can be said that with very few exceptions, the Treasury was looted and gutted with every ousting of an officer, and these ousters were many. It was inevitable that after several years of this, at the last convention, a naive delegate offered a motion to the effect that no more contracts be made of a sort that would enable discharged officers to sue the organization for salaries for unexpired terms. The proposal was a challenge for the sincerity of every newly elected officer present. The test was effective in a certain way. Immediately, a proposal was made. The newly elected acting president, Fred A. Toot, jumped to his feet excitedly to declare that if the motion was not withdrawn, he would resign. Toot explained, "You can't obtain the services of competent men unless you give them some security of means to support their families." What he meant was, of course, that the officers of the organization placed a value upon the power to milk the Treasury and upon their independence of control by the organization. The motion was withdrawn, not one delegate having the courage to speak plainly of the character of officers who would serve the Negro organization, the great program, only on condition of a stranglehold on the often looted treasury. Oni says, I would not include this in a Garvey biography. And he says that the writer sounds like a hater. I agree. The inevitable result is found in the present situation in which a war of money grabbing leaders is accompanied by the rapid breakup and disintegration of what once was a magnificently promising mass organization. A peculiar feature of the policy of Marcus Garvey is that it results in the destruction even of the machine itself. The organization for several years fixed its center of gravity in a scheme for a steamship line in connection with a utopian venture of trade with Africa. Now the salary takers have lost the steamship line in the sheriff's sale of the steamship General Gothal's, renamed the Booker T. Washington. Almost nothing of value is left to the contract holding officers except a piece of property on 138th Street in New York City, the headquarters of the organization, for the possession of which two sets of officers are fighting in the courts. The New York division of the organization had split away from the parent body and controls the mortgage property, and the faction of Garvey is fighting for its recovery. What will the fate of the Universal Negro Improvement Association? What will be the fate of the Universal Negro Improvement Association? That an organization of masses of exploited Negroes should throw off the disintegrating influences, discard its Garvey imposed opportunism, take on a clear program of struggle, and find new health and strength must be the wish of anyone who desires the emancipation of the Negro. Whether the saving of the Universal Negro Improvement Association is possible or cannot be said now. Every effort should be made to save it from the destruction and perversion. The tendency of most observers is to regard the organization as inseparable from Garvey and Garveyism, and to consider that the two will disappear from the scene together. But that is not a sound conclusion. The broken fragments of the UNIA contain some of the best rank and file material to be found, material which has not been corrupted by false leadership as its resistance proves. If the organization cannot be saved, at least out of the best of the fragments, something will grow that is more in line with the new tendencies. But Garveyism has been the dominant note in the Negro masses' activity in America for nearly a decade. When Garveyism evaporates, what will remain? An article by Abram L. Harris in the April number of The Crisis contains the following interesting observation. The social unrest among the Negro race, which we waxed philosophical a few years back, was not completely exhausted by the Garvey movement fiasco. Much of the ferment remains. 2 years ago, a friend of mine wrote this about the Garvey movement. It is just another name for the psychology of the American Negro peasantry, for the surge of race consciousness felt by Negroes throughout the world, the intelligent as well as the ignorant. Though visionary and perhaps impossible of accomplishment, it afforded a mental relaxation for the long submerged Negro peasantry. Balked desire, repressed longings must have an outlet. My friend then queried, after Garvey, what? Had I known what I think I know today, I would have answered, communism. If what the writer means is the merging of the mass unrest of the Negro population and the advanced section of the labor movement, I believe the quoted prediction is correct. Garvey says that guy sounds like a hater, just a little bit. This is by Cyril Briggs, The Decline of the Garvey Movement, written in the Communist magazine of June 1931. We're on page 174. Garveyism, or Negro Zionism, rose on the crest of the wave of discontent and revolutionary ferment which swept the capitalist world as a result of the post-war crisis. Increased national oppression of the Negroes arising out of the post-war crisis, together with the democratic slogans thrown out by the liberal imperialist demagogues during the World War, right of self-determination for all nations, etc., served to bring to the surface the latent national aspirations of the Negro masses. These aspirations were considerably strengthened with the return of the Negro worker and poor families who had been conscripted to save the world for democracy. Sounds like today's rhetoric. These returned with a wider horizon, new perspectives of human rights, and a new confidence in themselves as a result of their experiences and disillusionment in the war. Their return strengthened the morale of the Negro masses and stiffened their resistance. So-called race riots took the place of lynching bees and massacres. The Negro masses were fighting back. In addition, many of the more politically advanced of the Negro workers were looking to the example of the victorious Russian proletariat as the way out of their oppression. The conviction was growing that the proletarian revolution in Russia was the beginning of the worldwide united movement of downtrodden classes and oppressed peoples. Even larger numbers of the Negro masses were becoming more favorable toward the revolutionary labor movement. The growing national revolutionary sentiment was seized upon by the Negro petty bourgeoisie under the leadership of the demagogue Marcus Garvey and diverted into utopian reactionary back to Africa channels. There were various other reformist attempts to formulate the demands of the Negro masses and to create a program of action which would appeal to all elements of the dissatisfied Negro people. None of these met with even the partial and temporary success which greeted the Garvey movement. The leadership of the Garvey movement consisted of the poorest stratum of the Negro intellectuals, declassed elements, struggling businessmen, and preachers, lawyers without a brief, etc., who stood more or less close to the Negro masses and felt sharply the effects of the crisis. The movement represented a split away from the official Negro bourgeoisie leadership in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, which even then was linked up with the imperialists. The main social base of the movement was the Negro agricultural workers and the farming masses groaning under terrific oppression of peonage and sharecropper slavery, and the backward sections of the Negro industrial workers, for the most part recent migrants from the plantations into the industrial centers of the North and South. These saw in the movement an escape from national oppression, a struggle for the Negro rights throughout the world, including freedom from the oppression of the Southern landlords and for ownership of the land. To the small advanced industrial Negro proletariat who were experienced in the class struggle, the Garvey movement had little appeal. While the movement never had the millions organizationally enrolled that its leaders claimed, it did have, in 1921, at the time of its second Congress, nearly 100,000 members on its books, as revealed by an analysis made by W.A. Domingo of the deliberately confused financial statements given by the leadership to the delegates of the Second Congress. Moreover, the movement exercised a tremendous ideological influence over millions of Negroes outside of its ranks. Greetings, Sister Raw. How are you tonight? The movement began as a radical petty bourgeoisie national movement, reflecting to a great extent in its early stages the militancy of the toiling masses and its demands expressing their readiness for struggle against oppression in the United States. From the very beginning, there were two sides inherent to the movement, a democratic side and a reactionary side. In the early stage, the democratic side dominated. To get the masses into the movement, the national reformist leaders were forced to resort to demagogy. The pressure of the militant masses in the movement further forced them to adopt progressive slogans. The program of the first Congress was full of militant demands expressing the readiness for struggle in the United States. A Negro mass movement with such perspectives was correctly construed by the imperialists as a direct threat to imperialism, and pressure began to be put on the leadership. A threat of the imperialists inspired and backed up by the leadership of the NAACP to exclude Garvey from the country on his return from a tour of the West Indies brought about the complete and abject capitulation of the national reformist leaders. Crawling on his knees before the imperialists, Garvey enunciated the infamous doctrine that the Negro must be loyal to all flags under which he lives. This was the complete negation of the Negro liberation struggle. It was followed by an agreement with the Ku Klux Klan in which the reformists catered for the support of the Southern senators in an attempt to secure repatriation of the Negro masses by deportation to Liberia. Wow. The objective difficulties and subjective weaknesses of the movement arising out of the reformist leadership and its attempt to harmonize the demands of all the dissatisfied elements among the Negro people inevitably led to betrayal of the toiling masses. While never actually waging real struggle for a national liberation, the movement did make some militant demands in the beginning. However, these demands were soon thrown overboard as the reactionary side of the movement gained dominance. There followed a complete and shameful abandonment and betrayal of the struggle of the Negro masses in the United States and the West Indies. The right of the Negro majorities in the West Indies and in the Black Belt of the United States to determine and control their own government was completely negated by the Garvey national reformists as by the imperialists. The Garvey movement became a tool of the imperialists. Even its struggle slogans for the liberation of the African peoples, which had always been given main stress, were abandoned, and the movement began to peddle the illusion of a peaceful return to Africa. At first, giving expression to the disgust which the Negro masses felt for the religious illusions of liberation through the divine intervention, etc., the Garvey movement became one of the main social carriers of these illusions among the masses, with Marcus Garvey taking on the role of high priest after the resignation and defection of the chaplain general, Bishop McGuire. Feudal orders, high sounding titles, and various commercial adventures were substituted for the struggle demanded in the earlier stages. How completely the reactionary side came to dominate the movement is shown in 1. The acceptance of the Ku Klux Klan viewpoint that the United States is a white man's country and that the Negro masses living here are rightfully denied all democratic rights. 2. The rejection by the leaders at the 1929 convention in Jamaica, BWI, of a resolution condemning imperialism. In both cases, these betrayals just noted were further carried to their logical conclusion. In Garvey's bid for an alliance with the Ku Klux Klan, and in an article he wrote in the Black Man, Jamaica organ of the movement, shortly after the 1929 convention, in which he attacked the Jamaica workers for organizing into unions of the TUUL to better their conditions. In this article, he attacked communism as a menace to the imperialists and warned the Negro masses of Jamaica that they would not dare to accept and foster something tabooed by another country. So complete was the counter-revolutionary degeneration of the national reformists that the oppressing imperialism was openly accepted by them as their mother country. The imperialist oppressors were presented to the masses as friends who have treated him, the Negro, if not fairly, with some kind of consideration. The decline of the movement synchronized with the subsiding of the post-war crisis. As a result, both of the lessening of the economic pressure on the masses and the awakening of the most militant sections of the membership to the betrayals among being carried out by the national reformists behind the gesture of struggle phases and demagogy, the masses began to drop away from the movement. Relieved of the pressure of the militant masses, the movement began to assert more and more its reactionary, anti-democratic side. Already, the second Congress, it was already at the second Congress, it was evident that the national reformists were losing their grip on the masses. As a result of the widespread exposures carried on by the Negro radicals against the dishonest business schemes and consistent betrayals of the National Negro Liberation Movement by the Garvey reformists, the sympathetic masses outside of the organization were becoming more and more critical of the national reformists. Within the organization itself, there was such widespread dissatisfaction about the top leadership was forced to make sacrificial goats of several rubber stamp lieutenants. Within a few months of closing, Within a few months of the closing of the Second Congress, the first big mass defections occurred in California and Philadelphia. These revolts, however, were led by reformists and were significant only from the point of view that the growing disintegration of the movement. From 1921, the movement had undergone a continuous process of deterioration and breakup as the masses increasingly came to realize the treacherous character of the national reformist leaders. The recent decision of Garvey to sell the Jamaica properties of the organization and pocketing the proceeds and take up his residence in Europe, far from the masses he has plundered and betrayed, denotes a high stage in the collapse of this reactionary movement, whose dangerous ideology, pointed out by the Communist International, because remember, Cyril is a communist, bears not a single democratic trait. Historically, however, the movement has certain progressive achievements. It undoubtedly helped to crystallize the national aspiration of the Negro masses. Moreover, the Negro masses achieved a certain political ripening as a result of their experience and disillusionment with this movement. The betrayal of these aspirations and the national liberation struggle by the Garvey National Reformists was facilitated: 1, the immaturity of the Negro working class; 2, the weakness both in theoretical and organizational strength of the revolutionary labor movement in the United States at that time. Today, as the result of large-scale migrations into the industrial centers of the large numbers of Negroes from the plantations, a strong Negro proletariat has come into being, developing in the class struggle and freeing themselves of petty bourgeoisie influences and reformist illusions. Further, as the result of the present crisis and the correct application of the Communist Party of the USA of the CI line on the Negro question, the Negro liberation movement again goes forward, this time under the sign of proletarian hegemony and the wages of a relentless fight against imperialism for unconditional Negro equality, including the right of self-determination of the Negro majorities in the Black Belt of the South and in the West Indies and the Negro peoples of Africa. Before concluding, it is necessary to emphasize here that the Garvey movement, while in decline and on the verge of collapse, still represents a most dangerous reactionary force, exercising considerable ideological influence over large masses of Negroes. It will not it will not do to ignore this movement, which is most dangerous in its disintegration because of the desperate attempts being made by the national reformist leaders to maintain their influences over the Negro masses, either by saving the movement as it is or by luring the dissatisfied masses into other organizations under the control of the national reformists. The situation affords considerable opportunity for the winning of the Negro masses away from the influence of the reformists, and in another article, I will deal with the task of the party in relation to the disintegration and decline of the Garvey movement. That was a mouthful, but that was written by a communist. All right. Bwana Haguziki says, it's interesting, this Cyril Briggs guy was a mulatto. His dad was, this, a white plantation seeker, and his mom a black woman. No wonder he sounds like a hater. And his other side. And it's his other side. Yeah. Only wants to know if this is a PDF. This man doesn't understand America is the white man's country. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, these little gems that you find out about people when you hear and listen to them go on their line of their rhetoric, knowing that he was a mulatto, meaning he had mixed interests, is necessary to know. It sounds like he almost hated Garvey. These all sound like haters of Garvey. And you guys drop a 1 in the chat if you want me to continue, because this last one is long and it's going to take us past 8 o'clock. You want to read it. John Henrik Clark. This last section was written by John Henrik Clark. It's called The Impact of Marcus Garvey on the Harlem Renaissance. We can go on or we can stop right there. This is not a PDF. It's available in PDF form, though, from archive.org. Okay. All right, I got ones. All right. All right, I got 2 ones and I got a it can wait. The impact of Garvey on the Harlem Renaissance. You guys let me know. Because Dr. Clark is long-winded. He is at least 12 pages. So all right. So we're going to go with the majority. The majority of respondents say they want to hear it. All right. All right, guys. Well, I'm going to get out of here tonight. I'm going to go check on my aunt. I want to say thank you for all of your support from Bawana Haguziki, The Forecast, Sister Raw, Dorico Cooper, Tinkerbell 87, and Brother Bakari. I appreciate each and every one of you. I will be here tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll be picking up on page 180, reading The Impact of Marcus Garvey on the Harlem Renaissance by Dr. John Henrik Clark. These are the commentaries. And tomorrow we will probably be able to get into some of Garvey's words on this transition period. We'll be reading some letters that he wrote while he was incarcerated, uh, and different letters that he wrote from that Atlanta prison. They weren't long letters, but they were interesting letters. All right. I thank you both. I thank you all for being here. I want to say shout out to Oni from the Pro Black Perspective. Shout out to Anthony McPhail. Shout out to KW Don 7. Thank you so much for listening, Koku. I appreciate each and every one of you. All right, you guys. Have a great night. Peace.